Imagine watching 25,000 of the best equipped soldiers in the world march towards 6,000 starving, disease-ridden men who can barely lift their weapons. You'd bet everything on the larger army, wouldn't you? Any sane person would. But by the end of that day in 1415, something absolutely mental happened that still makes historians scratch their heads. 10,000 elite warriors lay dead in the mud, whilst the ragtag bunch who should have been slaughtered lost fewer than 400 men. How on earth does that even happen? Stick with me, because what unfolded on that French field changed warfare forever and created one of history's most legendary underdog stories. Right, let's paint the picture properly. It's late October 1415, somewhere in northern France. Dawn is breaking over this muddy valley, and you can see your breath in the cold morning air. On one side of this field, you've got the French absolutely massive army. Yeah, we're talking 25,000 blokes. And these aren't just any soldiers. These are dukes, counts, barons, the cream of French nobility, all decked out in armor that costs more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. They're gleaming in the early light, looking every bit the unstoppable force they believe themselves to be. They're rested, they're well-fed, they're fighting on their own turf. They outnumber their enemy more than 4 to 1. In their minds, this isn't even a proper battle. It's basically a formality before they go home for supper. Now look across the valley at the English. Bloody hell. What a state. 6,000 men. Most of them longbowmen, basically peasants with wooden stakes and boots caked in mud. They're absolutely knackered. Disease has ripped through their ranks. They're starving. Some haven't had a proper kip in days. Even their king, Henry V, is running a fever. These lads have marched across France, lost hundreds to dysentery, and now they're trapped. The French nobles are so confident that we're going to win that they've already started dividing up the English prisoners. They're replanning to ransom. Some are even discussing which English lords they're personally going to capture. To them, this isn't a battle, it's already finished. So what happens when these two armies finally clash? By the time the sun sets that day, roughly 10,000 Frenchmen are lying dead in the mud, including some of the most powerful nobles in all of Europe. The English, maybe 400 casualties. Let that properly sink in for a moment. One exhausted English soldier somehow survived what 25 armored French knights couldn't. Something about that battlefield turned into an absolute nightmare for the French, and even their expensive plate armor couldn't save them. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. This wasn't some lucky accident. Henry V actually wanted the French to charge at him. He needed them to take the bait, because hidden in his desperate situation was a weapon the French simply weren't prepared for. The French thought they were charging at a bunch of starving peasants with bows. They were actually charging straight into a carefully laid trap. Why would France, with all their military might and experience, walk directly into the deadliest ambush of the century? By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how it happened. So why was this battle even happening in the first place? To properly understand how an English army that was massively outnumbered managed to absolutely demolish France's finest warriors, you need a bit of context. For decades, England and France had been locked in this brutal struggle over crowns, territory, and royal bloodlines, what history now calls the 100 Years' War. Catchy name, right? Though it actually lasted even longer than that. But that's beside the point. This wasn't meant to be some grand English campaign, though. By 1415, England was in a right state. Plagues had devastated the population. There'd been political coups and power struggles. The royal coffers were basically empty. The country was weak, vulnerable, not exactly in a position to be starting fights with powerful neighbors. Who in their right mind would choose this moment to invade France? Only one person had the guts, or the madness to try it. Henry V. This young king was focused, determined, and deadly serious about restoring English honor and prestige. He needed a victory, and he needed it fast. So he did something absolutely bonkers. He took the fight directly to France. Henry invaded in August 1415 and managed to capture the port of Harfleur. But that victory came at a horrific price. Disease swept through his army like wildfire. Supplies ran out. Men were collapsing in the mud, dying by the hundreds from dysentery and other illnesses. By October, the whole campaign was falling apart. Any sensible commander would have retreated immediately, cut their losses, sailed back home to England with whatever forces they had left. But France had other ideas entirely. The French assembled what can only be described as a juggernaut of military power. 10,000 knights fully armored nobles who'd trained their entire lives for close-quarters combat. 4,000 mounted cavalry fast, disciplined riders built for devastating shock attacks. 6,000 heavy men-at-arms, equipped with swords, poleaxes, and maces. 2,000 crossbowmen, plus another 3,000 archers and levy troops. In total, 25,000 warriors, all ready to wipe the English off the map in a single, overwhelming charge. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion, though. The French wanted revenge. They'd been humiliated at Crécy and Poitiers battles. They'd lost decades earlier, but still burned with shame over. This was their chance to settle old scores and prove that French military might was supreme. Henry started marching toward Calais, the closest English stronghold, but the French raced ahead and cut him off. They weren't just hunting an army anymore, they were hunting a cornered king who had nowhere left to run. Now, the night before the battle is where things get really interesting. It's October 24th, and the rain is absolutely hammering down on the countryside around Agincourt. The mud's getting thicker and thicker, turning into this heavy, sticky glue. The English are shivering under soaked tents or just sleeping out in the open because there is not enough shelter. No food to speak of, no warmth, no comfort whatsoever. These lads are miserable, cold, hungry, and terrified. Meanwhile, across the valley, the French nobles are having an absolute party. Wine flowing freely, roasted meats, fresh bread. They're singing, laughing, celebrating the victory they're convinced is coming the next morning. Some are even polishing their armor, treating it like they're getting ready for a parade rather than a battle. The confidence, the arrogance, really is unbelievable. Henry gathered his captains that night and told them straight, "We may die tomorrow, but if we die fighting." The English camp fell silent after that. No songs, no boasting, just rain drumming on tents and the distant sound of French laughter carrying across the valley. Then dawn broke, revealing the battlefield in all its muddy glory. Henry formed his men into a single, narrow line. This wasn't necessarily his ideal tactical formation. It was what the land forced him into. His 6,000 soldiers stood between two dense forests, creating this natural corridor that was barely wide enough for a few hundred men to stand abreast. A killing ground. But here, as the clever bit it, meant the French could unuse their superior numbers to surround and overwhelm the English. They could only come straight ahead, and that played right into Henry's hands. The English longbowmen hammered wooden stakes into the mud at an angle, pointing toward the enemy like the teeth of some massive predator. These stakes would prove absolutely crucial in what was about to unfold. Across the valley, the French deployed in this massive, intimidating formation. The front line had 10,000 dismounted knights they'd been forced off their horses because of the deep mud and the cramped terrain. Behind them, another 6,000 men-at-arms stood in deep ranks, pushing forward. On Agincourt, 4,000 cavalry split into two groups of 2,000, ready to swing around and crush the English longbowmen from the sides. And at the rear, 2,000 crossbowmen and 3,000 archers. It was a human wall that turned the valley into a funnel of bodies and iron. The two armies stared at each other across that muddy field, and then nothing happened. The French expected the English to just sit there, slowly starve, and eventually give up or die. Henry knew that waiting meant exactly the same thing, slow death. So he made a move that nobody expected. He ordered his banners forward. The English longbowmen actually yanked their sharpened stakes out of the ground, advanced several dozen paces closer to the French, and drove the stakes back into the mud. Absolute madness. Ground dragged at their mounts. Still, they pushed on, trying to swing around and crush those English longbowmen before they could do any real damage. They rode straight into a hurricane of arrows. English longbowmen could loose up to 15 arrows per minute. With thousands of them firing in coordinated volleys, the sky literally turned dark. Visors were pierced. War horses were shot down mid-stride, crashing to the ground and throwing their riders. Panicked horses crashed into their own infantry, creating chaos in the French second line before those troops even joined the fight. The French cavalry meant to win the flanks and turn the battle collapsed in minutes. Meanwhile, The French front line of 10,000 dismounted knights was pushing forward toward those English stakes, all whilst under relentless arrow fire. Now, here's the thing about arrows, and plate armor their arrows couldn't always pierce the thick metal plates, but they absolutely shattered joints, cut tendons, and crushed windpipes. Where the armor was weaker, by the time these knights actually reached the English defensive line, they were already bleeding, exhausted, and struggling to breathe. Still, their sheer mass thousands of heavily armored men pushing forward slammed into the English line with tremendous force, and that's when the trap truly snapped shut. The English men-at-arms braced themselves behind those wooden stakes, striking downward at French knights who were now trapped and couldn't maneuver properly. The longbowmen held back for now, continuing to loose volley after volley over their own lines, hammering the French ranks as they stumbled forward through the mud. Here's where French military doctrine completely failed them. All that expensive plate armor meant immobility, especially in thick mud. The English, wearing lighter mail and leather, could actually move and survive. Then the second French wave 6,000 heavy menats zimmed into the rear of their own knights who were already engaged. They didn't reinforce the attack. They burit Italiano. The French were literally crushing themselves under their own weight. Knights at the front were being pushed forward by the mass behind them, unable to fight properly, unable to retreat, unable to even fall down because the press of bodies was so tight. Henry saw what was happening and reportedly whispered to his captains, "Hold, let them come." And they came helpless, blind, sinking deeper into the mud with every step. Only then did the English longbowmen drop their bows and draw their secondary weapons: axes, mallets, knives, hammers. They rushed in from the flanks, nimble in the mud because they weren't weighed down by heavy armor, carving into this mass of armored bodies that couldn't even turn to face them. The valley became an absolute grinder. Knights were drowning face down in the mud, suffocated by their own armor and the weight of bodies on top of them. The finest warriors in Europe were dying in one of the most undignified ways imaginable. And in the middle of all this chaos, Henry V himself was fighting in the front ranks, leading by example, proving he was the type of king who deordered men to die whilst he watched from safety. At the rear of the French formation, the last 5,000 troops, archers, and levy troops watched this disaster unfolding in front of them. Should they advance? Should they retreat? They froze. They'd simply never seen their nobles die like this. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The French collapse began suddenly. Those who could still stand staggered backward, trying to escape the killing ground. Those who couldn't were swallowed by armor, bodies, and mud. The third French line watched the absolute catastrophe and made a choice. They withdrew without striking a single blow. They weren't going to die in that nightmare. By early afternoon, the field had gone silent. 10,000 French dead, lying in heaps in the mud. 400 English casualties. A 25-to-1 kill ratio that defied every single law of medieval warfare. Military scholars still study this battle, trying to understand how it was even possible. Agincourt didn't just break a French army, it fundamentally changed how people thought about warfare. It proved that the longbow, in the right hands and the right circumstances, was an absolutely terrifying weapon. It shattered the confidence of an entire kingdom. It demonstrated that discipline, terrain, awareness, and determination could humble Europe's richest and most powerful nobles. And at the center of it all stood Henry V, young, feverish, unyielding, a king who'd been forged in that mud and who completely reshaped the balance of power in the 100 Years' War. His reputation went from questionable young monarch to legendary warrior king in the span of a single afternoon. The battle proved something that aristocrats across Europe didn't want to believe, that common soldiers with the right weapons and training could defeat mountain knights, who'd spent their entire lives preparing for war. It was a lesson the nobility would be forced to learn again and again over the coming centuries. So there you have it, the story of how 6,000 exhausted, starving English soldiers defeated 25,000 of France's finest warriors through a combination of terrain, tactics, weapons, technology, and sheer bloody-minded determination. One of history's greatest underdog victories, and a battle that still captures the imagination over 600 years later. If you found this deep dive into medieval warfare as fascinating as I did putting it together, Do me a favor and smash that like button. Hit subscribe if you want more stories from history that sound too mad to be true but absolutely are. Drop a comment and let me know what historical battle you'd like to hear about next. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.